It was a cold, rainy night when I decided to take a shortcut through the old forest road to get home faster. The dense canopy above made the darkness even more oppressive, and the sound of raindrops hitting the leaves created an eerie symphony. I had driven this route countless times during the day, but at night, it felt like an entirely different world. As I navigated the winding path, my headlights caught a glimpse of a figure standing by the roadside. It was a woman, drenched from the rain, wearing a tattered white dress that clung to her slender frame. Her long, dark hair obscured her face, but I could see her shoulders trembling, either from the cold or from silent sobs. I hesitated for a moment, but then decided to pull over and offer assistance. Rolling down the window slightly, I called out to her, "Do you need help?" She slowly turned her head towards me, and as her hair parted, I was met with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through me. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't just leave her there. "Please, can you take me home?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door, and she slid in without a word. The air inside the car grew noticeably colder, and an unsettling silence settled between us. "Where do you live?" I inquired, trying to sound calm. She pointed ahead. "Just keep driving. I'll tell you when to turn." As we continued, the forest seemed to grow denser, and the road more treacherous. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Turn left here." I hadn't noticed any road before, but suddenly there it was, a narrow, overgrown path leading deeper into the woods. I turned, and after a few minutes, we arrived at an old, dilapidated house that looked as though it had been abandoned for years. "This is my home," she said, her voice echoing with a strange resonance. She opened the door and stepped out. "Thank you." Before I could respond, she vanished into the darkness. Feeling uneasy, I decided to leave immediately. But as I reversed the car, my headlights illuminated a faded sign near the entrance of the property. It read, "In memory of Emily Rose, 1985 to 2005. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized the woman I had just given a ride to had been dead for years. I sped away, vowing never to take that shortcut again. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but every time I pass by that forest, I feel a cold chill and the haunting memory of those hollow eyes staring back at me. The day I moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of the quaint town, the air was thick with the crispness of autumn. The townspeople had spoken in hushed tones about the house's storied past, weaving tales that danced between reverence and trepidation. I, however, dismissed these as mere folklore, relics of overactive imaginations. Eager to make this house my home, I spent the day meticulously unpacking, each item finding its place amidst the antique fixtures and ornate moldings. As dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a sense of curiosity tugged at me. The attic remained unexplored, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. The narrow staircase leading up was cloaked in shadows, each step releasing a prolonged creak that echoed through the silent house. A musty scent, reminiscent of aged paper and forgotten memories, enveloped me as I ascended. Upon reaching the top, I groped along the wall for a light switch, only to realize that the attic had never been graced with electricity. Relying solely on the feeble beam of my flashlight, I began to survey the space. The attic was a time capsule. Dust-laden furniture stood solemnly, shrouded in white sheets that had yellowed with age. Trunks, their leather exteriors cracked and worn, hinted at treasures and stories long forgotten. In the far corner, partially obscured by an ornate armoire, stood an antique mirror. Its frame was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, adorned with intricate carvings of ivy and roses, though years of neglect had allowed grime to dull its once lustrous surface. Drawn to it, I wiped away a layer of dust, revealing the tarnished glass beneath. As I gazed into the mirror, the beam of my flashlight creating a dim halo around my reflection, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Behind me, a shadow seemed to flit across the room. My pulse quickened. I spun around, the flashlight casting erratic beams, but the attic remained still, its silence almost mocking. A chill, unrelated to the autumnal cold, crept up my spine. I chastised myself for letting the eerie ambience get the better of me and turned back to the mirror. This time, the reflection was unmistakably altered. The room within the mirror appeared as it might have been in its prime. Furniture polished and arranged with care, the air of neglect replaced by one of warmth and life. And then I saw her. A woman stood behind me, her visage pale, eyes hollow yet piercing, filled with an indescribable sorrow. Her attire was antiquated, a flowing gown that whispered of centuries past. My breath caught in my throat. Heart pounding, I whirled around once more, the flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness. The attic was as it had been, silent, empty, undisturbed. A sense of unreality washed over me. Was my mind playing tricks? I turned back to the mirror, and my blood ran cold. The woman was now closer, her ethereal form almost pressing against the glass from the inside. Her hand, delicate and translucent, reached out as if to touch my shoulder. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but the message was clear. Leave this place. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of a worn rug. I fell hard, the impact jarring, but adrenaline masked the pain. From my position on the floor, I looked up at the mirror. The woman's face had contorted into an expression of anguish and desperation. Her eyes locked onto mine, conveying a plea that transcended the boundaries of the physical world. Scrambling to my feet, I fled the attic, the descent down the narrow staircase a blur. I didn't stop until I was in my bedroom, the door locked behind me, my back pressed against the cold wood as I slid to the floor, gasping for breath. The house, once filled with the promise of new beginnings, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in with the weight of unseen eyes. Sleep was a distant hope that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the windows, set my nerves on edge. The image of the woman haunted me, her silent message echoing in my mind. As the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, I resolved to uncover the truth behind the apparition. Later that morning, I sought out the town's historian, an elderly man whose eyes held the weight of decades of knowledge. Over a cup of steaming tea in his cluttered study, I recounted my experience. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression grave. When I finished, he leaned back, his chair creaking in protest. "The house you reside in has a tragic past," he began. "In the late 19th century, it was home to a young woman named Eliza. She was engaged to be married, but her fiancé died suddenly, leaving her heartbroken. Overcome with grief, she secluded herself in the attic, the very room you described, and eventually took her own life." A shiver ran through me. The pieces fit too neatly to be mere coincidence. The historian continued, "It's said that her spirit remains bound to the mirror she cherished, unable to move on." The weight of his words settled heavily upon me. Late one evening, I found myself driving along a desolate country road, the kind that seems to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, and the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath my tires. I was returning from a weekend getaway, eager to reach the comfort of my home. As I navigated a particularly sharp bend, my headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. A young woman, drenched from head to toe, her clothes clinging to her slender frame. Instinctively, I slowed down and rolled down the window. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" I called out. She approached the car, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes, wide and glassy, met mine. "Please, can you take me home?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Without hesitation, I unlocked the passenger door, and she slid in, her wet clothes leaving a damp imprint on the seat. "Thank you," she murmured. "Where do you live?" I inquired, glancing at her pale face. "Just up ahead," she replied, pointing further down the road. We drove in silence for a few minutes before she directed me to turn onto a narrow, overgrown path leading to an old, dilapidated house. The windows were dark, and the air felt heavy with neglect. "This is it," she said softly. I stopped the car, and she turned to me, her eyes now filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Thank you for bringing me home," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "Do you need me to walk you to the door?" I offered. "No, I'll be fine." With that, she stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. I watched until she disappeared into the shadows. A sense of unease settled over me, but I shrugged it off and continued my journey home. The next day, her image lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. I decided to return to the house to check on her. As I approached, I noticed the property looked even more forlorn in the daylight. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Peering through a grimy window, I saw that the interior was covered in dust, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. A neighbor happened to pass by and noticed my presence. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I'm looking for the young woman who lives here. I gave her a ride last night. I explained. The man's face paled. That house has been abandoned for years. But I saw her go inside, I insisted. He shook his head. You're not the first to say that. Legend has it that a young woman drowned nearby decades ago. They say her spirit still roams these roads, trying to find her way home. A chill ran down my spine as the realization set in. I had given a ride to a ghost, her restless soul still seeking solace. To this day, I avoid that road at night, haunted by the memory of the girl who never truly made it home. It was a cold, moonless night when I decided to take a detour through the old forest road, a shortcut I had never used before. The dense canopy above swallowed any remnants of starlight, leaving the path ahead illuminated solely by my car's feeble headlights. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and an unsettling silence enveloped the surroundings, broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. As I navigated the winding road, a sudden movement caught my eye. A figure darted across the path, disappearing into the trees on the other side. Instinctively, I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. Heart pounding, I peered into the darkness but saw nothing. Convincing myself it was likely a deer or some nocturnal animal, I took a deep breath and resumed driving, albeit at a slower pace. A few miles later, my car's engine began to sputter. The dashboard lights flickered before the vehicle stalled completely. Frustrated, I turned the key in the ignition repeatedly, but the engine refused to roar back to life. Resigned, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the chilly night, hoping to find a cell signal to call for assistance. The forest seemed to close in around me, the towering trees casting long, menacing shadows. As I walked a short distance from the car, my flashlight beam caught something unusual, a dilapidated wooden sign partially obscured by overgrown vines. Curiosity piqued. I brushed away the foliage to reveal the words, Ravens Hollow, established 1823. I had never heard of Ravens Hollow before, and the idea of an old, perhaps abandoned village intrigued me. Thinking I might find help, or at least a place to shelter until morning, I decided to follow the narrow, overgrown path indicated by the sign. The trail was treacherous, with gnarled roots and uneven terrain, but eventually, it opened up to a clearing. There, bathed in the pale glow of my flashlight, stood a cluster of antiquated buildings. The architecture was reminiscent of the early 19th century, with cobblestone streets and gas lamps that had long since extinguished. The air was thick with an aura of abandonment, yet an odd sense of preservation hung over the place, as if it had been frozen in time. As I ventured deeper into the village, I noticed that the windows of the houses were intact, yet dark, and the doors were closed but not locked. An unsettling feeling gnawed at me, but the prospect of finding a working phone or some form of communication kept me moving forward. I approached what appeared to be the town's inn, its sign creaking on rusty hinges. Pushing the door open, I was met with a musty odor, a mix of dust and aged wood. The interior was eerily pristine, with chairs neatly arranged around tables, as if awaiting patrons who had long since departed. A grand fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and empty. On the counter lay an old, leather-bound ledger. Curiosity overcoming caution, I opened it to find pages filled with names and dates. The last entry marked October 31st, 1847. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that no one had set foot in this place for over a century. Suddenly, the sound of distant music reached my ears, a haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the village square. Drawn to it, I left the inn and made my way toward the source. As I approached, the music grew louder, more distinct, and I could make out the flickering glow of lanterns. Turning the corner, I froze in disbelief. The square was alive with activity. Men and women in period attire danced and laughed, their faces obscured by ornate masks. Stalls lined the perimeter, offering goods that looked freshly made. It was as if I had stepped back in time. My mind raced to rationalize what I was witnessing. A reenactment, perhaps? But in the dead of night, in an abandoned village? As I stood there, a woman detached herself from the revelry and approached me. Her dress was a deep crimson, and her mask, adorned with feathers, concealed her features save for piercing green eyes. "Welcome, traveler," she said, her voice smooth and inviting. "Join us in our festivities." "What is this place?" I stammered. "This is Raven's Hollow," she replied with a smile. "And tonight, we celebrate All Hallows' Eve." A sense of dread washed over me. "But that's impossible. Her smile widened, and she extended her hand. "Come dance with me." Against my better judgment, I took her hand. Her touch was cold, sending a shiver through me. She led me to the center of the square, and as we danced, the world around me blurred. The music became a cacophony, the faces of the revelers distorted, and a suffocating darkness closed in. I awoke with a start, lying on the forest floor, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. Disoriented, I stumbled back to the road, finding my car parked where I had left it, the engine now starting without issue. To this day, I am haunted by. As I drove away from the forest, the events of the previous night haunted my thoughts. The image of the spectral woman and the eerie village lingered in my mind, leaving me with an unsettling feeling. I tried to rationalize the experience, convincing myself it was a vivid nightmare or a trick of the mind. However, the dampness on my car seat and the lingering scent of decay told a different story. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that night refused to fade. I began to notice subtle changes around me. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and whispers echoed in the stillness of my home. At first, I dismissed these occurrences as paranoia, but they grew more persistent and intrusive. One evening, as I was preparing for bed, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. A fleeting shadow that vanished as quickly as it appeared. My heart raced, and a cold sweat formed on my brow. I stood frozen, staring into the mirror, but nothing seemed amiss. Shaking off the unease, I turned away, only to hear a faint, familiar voice whisper my name. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind seemed amplified, feeding my growing dread. In the darkness, I felt a presence, a weight pressing down on me, suffocating and relentless. I closed my eyes, willing it to be a figment of my imagination, but the sensation only intensified. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and mounting terror. I sought help, consulting with priests and paranormal experts, but nothing alleviated the haunting. The whispers grew louder, the shadows more oppressive. I could feel her, the woman from the forest, her sorrow and anger intertwining, latching onto my very soul. Desperation led me back to the forest, to the place where it all began. I hoped to find answers, a way to appease the restless spirit that had attached itself to me. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and an unnatural silence enveloped the surroundings. The path seemed to shift beneath my feet, leading me to a clearing I hadn't seen before. In the center stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its branches twisted and barren. At its base lay a weathered gravestone, the inscription obscured by moss and time. A sense of recognition washed over me, and I knew this was her resting place. Kneeling before the grave, I whispered apologies, pleading for forgiveness, hoping to release the hold she had on me. As the words left my lips, a cold wind swept through the clearing, and the oppressive weight lifted momentarily. But as I stood to leave, a searing pain shot through my chest. Gasping, I looked down to see dark tendrils wrapping around me, constricting tighter with each breath. The realization struck me with horrifying clarity. She had no intention of letting go. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows swallowing the light. The last thing I heard was her voice, a chilling whisper that echoed in my mind. "You are mine now." Darkness consumed me, and I was lost to the abyss, forever entwined with the vengeful spirit of Raven's Hollow. The house was old and creaky, with a history that stretched back centuries. It had been passed down through my family for generations, and I was the latest caretaker. I lived alone, and the silence of the old house was often deafening. One night, as I was settling in for bed, I heard a strange noise coming from the attic. It was a creaking sound, like an old door slowly opening and closing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to move, but I couldn't help but listen. The creaking sound grew louder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I slowly got out of bed and crept towards the attic door. The door was old and warped, and it squeaked as I turned the handle. I pushed the door open and stepped into the darkness. The attic was cold and dusty, and the only light came from a small window high up in the roof. I held my breath and listened, but the creaking sound had stopped. I turned around to leave, but I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing in the shadows, watching me. It was tall and thin, with long, bony fingers. It had no face, just a blank white space where its face should have been. I screamed and ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. I locked myself in my bedroom and didn't come out until morning. I never went back up to the attic again, and I never heard the creaking sound again. I don't know what it was that I saw that night, but I know it wasn't human. I'm not sure if it was a ghost or some other kind of supernatural creature, but I know it was something evil. I've lived in that house for many years now, and I've never seen or heard anything strange again. But I'll never forget the night I saw the faceless figure in the attic. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. The attic was a large, dark space that was filled with old furniture and boxes. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a small window high up in the roof. The attic was always cold, even in the summer. I had always been afraid of the attic, even as a child. I didn't know why, but I just had a feeling that something bad had happened there. The figure was tall and thin, with long, bony fingers. It had no face, just a blank white space where its face should have been. It was wearing a long, black robe, and it was standing in the shadows, watching me. I was so scared that I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen in fear. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, I was able to scream. I screamed as loud as I could, and then I turned and ran out of the attic. I didn't stop running until I reached my bedroom. I slammed the door shut and locked it, and then I crawled into bed and pulled the covers over my head. I lay there for a long time, shaking and crying. I was so scared that I didn't think I would ever be able to sleep again. I don't know how long I slept, but it was morning when I finally woke up. The sun was shining through my window, and I could hear the birds singing outside. I got out of bed and went to the bathroom. I looked in the mirror, and I could see that I was still pale and shaken. I decided to go downstairs and make some breakfast. I was so hungry that I could have eaten a horse. I went into the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee and a piece of toast. I sat at the table and ate my breakfast, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finished my breakfast and went back upstairs. I decided to take a shower and get dressed. I wanted to get out of the house for a while. I took a shower and got dressed, and then I went downstairs and grabbed my keys. I went out the front door and locked it behind me. I walked down the street to the coffee shop. I went inside and ordered a cup of coffee. I sat at a table and drank my coffee, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finished my coffee and went back out to the street. I decided to go for a walk in the park. I walked to the park and sat down on a bench. I closed my eyes and tried to relax, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about the figure in the attic. I don't know what it was, but I know it was something evil. It started with a text message. I was getting ready for bed when my phone buzzed. I expected it to be a spam message or a friend, but when I looked, it was just a single word from an unknown number. Help. I frowned. Wrong number, probably. I ignored it. A few minutes later, another message. Please. He's coming. A chill ran down my spine. I typed back. Who is this? No response. I set my phone down, trying to shake the unease settling in my gut. But then, just as I turned off the light, ring. The same unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Static. Then, through the crackling noise, a faint whisper. Don't let him in. The line went dead. I sat there, heart pounding, staring at my screen. My apartment was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. I checked my front door. It was locked. My windows locked. Nothing was out of place. Then, knock, knock, knock. Slow, rhythmic, right outside my door. I crept forward, my breath caught in my throat. Peeking through the peephole, I expected to see a neighbor, a prankster, someone. But there was no one there. I stood frozen for a long time before stepping back. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Then my phone buzzed again. A new message. From my own number. You shouldn't have opened the door. I spun around, and the closet door behind me creaked open. I didn't move. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. Then, from the shadows inside, a whisper. I see you. The door slammed shut on its own. I grabbed my phone and bolted out of my apartment, nearly tripping over my own feet. I didn't stop running until I was outside, breath coming in ragged gasps. The parking lot was empty. Silent. My car sat under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Then my phone buzzed again. Another message from my own number. You're not safe out there either. I turned, scanning the lot. My apartment windows loomed above me, dark and empty. But in the reflection of my car's window, I saw someone standing behind me. I spun around, nothing. The lot was still empty. But when I looked back at the reflection, The figure was closer. Too close. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of the lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't stop driving until I reached a motel 2 towns over. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I called a friend and told them everything. They laughed it off. Just a prank, they said. Someone messing with you. But then I checked my phone again. The messages were gone. All of them. No record of a call. No unknown number. Nothing. Like it never happened. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, maybe a waking nightmare. I tried to move on. But last night, 2 months later, I woke up to my phone buzzing. One new message. From my own number. I found you. I stared at the message, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't given anyone my new number. I had moved to a different city, changed my locks, stopped using social media. I did everything I could to disappear. But it still found me. A second message came through. Check your closet. My stomach twisted. No, I wasn't going to fall for it again. I wasn't going to let fear control me. But then, knock, knock, knock. Not at my door. At the closet. I gripped my phone with shaking hands, forcing myself to breathe. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Another message. Let me in. No. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, but as soon as I reached for the handle, BZZZT. A new message. A photo. I hesitated. My hands were trembling as I tapped it open. It was a picture of me, sitting in my bed, holding my phone, with the closet door behind me, wide open. A hand was reaching out, something long and pale, with fingers far too many, stretching toward me. The air in my room grew thick, heavy, suffocating. My vision blurred, my heart slamming against my ribs. Then, the phone slipped from my hand, because something cold had just brushed the back of my neck. I tried to run. I swear I did. But before I could even scream, the closet door slammed shut, and everything went black. The next morning, my landlord found my apartment door wide open. My phone was on the floor, screen shattered, the last message still open. I told you not to open the door, but I was gone. The closet was empty, and no one has seen me since. I never believed in ghosts. Not until the night I moved into my grandmother's old house. She had passed away months ago, leaving behind a creaky Victorian home on the edge of a dying town. My parents wanted to sell it, but something about the place called to me. I convinced them to let me stay there for a while. It was just an old house. After all, what was the worst that could happen? The first few nights were uneventful. The wind howled through the trees, the floorboards groaned under my footsteps, and the pipes clanked now and then. Normal old house noises. But by the 4th night, I started noticing something else. It began with the attic door. The house had one of those pull-down attic ladders, hidden in the hallway ceiling. I had never opened it. There was no reason to. But on that 4th night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint creaking sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. But then I heard a soft, deliberate thud, like something heavy shifting above me. The attic. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. Then came another sound. Not a creak. Not a thud, but a slow, dragging noise. Something was moving up there. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and forced myself to step into the hallway. The attic door was shut, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side, listening. I stood there for a long time before convincing myself I was imagining things. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. The attic door was slightly open. I hadn't touched it. For the rest of the day, I avoided that part of the house. But as night fell, I forced myself to investigate, armed with a flashlight and a knife. Not that it would help against whatever I feared. I pulled down the attic ladder and climbed up. The attic was worse than I expected. It wasn't just full of dust and forgotten furniture. There were old paintings stacked against the walls, portraits of people I didn't recognize. And in the center of the room was a small, wooden rocking chair. It was rocking. I froze, staring as it moved ever so slightly, creaking with each slow motion. There was no wind, no draft, no reason for it to move. Then I saw the footprints in the dust. They led from the chair to the attic door. And they weren't mine. Something had been coming down at night. I ran. I slammed the attic shut and locked myself in my bedroom. That night, I barely breathed, too afraid to move. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. I'd sell the house. I'd never come back. But then around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The slow, dragging sound. But this time, it wasn't coming from the attic. It was coming from just outside my bedroom door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. The dragging sound was slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the wooden floor. It stopped just outside my bedroom door. I could hear it breathing, ragged, shallow breaths, as if struggling to inhale. Then a whisper. Low. Broken. My name. A sharp knock followed. 3 slow raps against the wood. I gripped my phone so tightly my fingers ached. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. Instead, I forced my trembling hand toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was losing my mind. Then scratching. Long, deliberate scratches, dragging from the top of the door to the bottom. My stomach twisted as I pictured long, yellowed fingernails carving into the wood. I had to get out. I opened my phone and typed a message to my parents. Something's in the house. Call the police. No service. I was trapped. The knob rattled. Not violently, just a slow, testing turn. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and braced myself. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No more breathing. No more scratching. Just silence. I didn't move for hours. Morning eventually came, sunlight slipping through the curtains like a lifeline. When I finally built up the courage to open the door, the hallway was empty. But there was something waiting for me. A piece of paper lying on the floor. It looked old, the edges yellowed and brittle. I picked it up with shaking hands. There was only one thing written on it. Why did you come back? I ran. I packed a bag, got in my car, and never looked back. My parents put the house up for sale, but something about it scared potential buyers away. It sat there, empty, untouched. A month later, we finally found a buyer. An older man, looking for a quiet place to retire. He seemed happy. Excited, even. 3 nights after moving in, he disappeared. No struggle. No sign of forced entry. Just an open attic door and a single rocking chair, moving ever so slightly in the darkness. I always hated the mirror in my grandmother's house. It was huge, tall enough to nearly touch the ceiling, framed in dark, twisted wood. It stood in the hallway, right outside the guest bedroom where I stayed as a child. My grandmother called it an heirloom, passed down for generations. But to me it was just wrong. Whenever I walked past it, I had the unsettling urge to glance at my reflection. And every time something felt off. It wasn't obvious at first. Just small things. My reflection took a fraction of a second too long to move. Sometimes I thought I saw it blinking when I hadn't. Other times its expression didn't quite match mine. I told myself it was just my imagination. But one night, I learned the truth. I was 16, visiting my grandmother during summer break. It was late, past midnight, and I got up to get some water. As I stepped into the hallway, I avoided looking at the mirror. The house was silent, except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. Then I heard it. A faint tap, 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 like fingernails against glass. I froze. The sound was coming from the mirror. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at me to run, I turned my head. My reflection was standing there. But it wasn't me. It was smiling. Not a normal smile. Something wide and unnatural, stretching too far across its face. Its eyes were locked onto mine, unblinking. And its hand was pressed against the inside of the glass. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The reflection didn't move. It just stood there, grinning, fingers twitching against the mirror's surface. Then it lifted its other hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed at me. I ran. I locked the guest room door, pulled the blankets over my head, and forced myself to stay awake. When morning came, the mirror was normal again. My reflection was just my reflection. But I never walked past it at night again. Years later, after my grandmother passed, my family began clearing out her house. My father offered me anything I wanted to keep. I took some books, an old necklace, small things to remember her by. Then he asked, "What about the mirror?" I told him to burn it. He laughed. Thought I was joking. But I wasn't. And neither was the thing inside the glass. I thought that would be the end of it. The mirror was left behind when we sold the house, and I never looked back. But things didn't go back to normal. At first, it was just a feeling, like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces, but when I turned, nothing was there. I told myself it was just paranoia, a lingering childhood fear. Then the tapping started. Not on a mirror. Not at first. The first time, I was in the kitchen late at night. I was washing dishes, my reflection faint in the window above the sink. Then tap, tap, tap. It came from the other side of the glass. I shut off the water, my pulse hammering. Outside, the yard was empty. Just darkness stretching past the porch light. But in the window's reflection, there was something standing behind me. I spun around, but the kitchen was empty. When I turned back to the window, my reflection was normal. But I knew what I had seen. After that, it got worse. I started waking up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom mirror. My reflection would linger a second too long after I moved. Sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I'd see it smiling. Then one night, I woke up to something different. The tapping was louder this time, more insistent. But it wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from inside my closet. I didn't move. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The closet door was closed, but I saw my bedroom mirror from where I lay. And in the reflection, the door was open. And something was standing inside. It was me, but not me. My reflection was inside the closet, head tilted at an unnatural angle, grinning. Its hand was raised, fingers slowly curling in a beckoning motion. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, in the silence, it whispered, "Let me in." That was the last straw. I packed a bag and left before sunrise. I checked into a motel, avoiding every mirror in the room. The next day I called my father. "Did you sell the mirror?" I asked. He hesitated. "No." My stomach dropped. He explained that the new homeowners didn't want it, so he put it in storage. In my old childhood home. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I drove back to town. I didn't tell my father why. I just said I needed to see the mirror one last time. The storage unit was cold and smelled like dust and rotting wood. The mirror was in the back, covered by a heavy cloth. I hesitated before pulling it off. For the first time in years, I faced the mirror directly. My reflection stared back. Normal. Just me. But then, it blinked. I didn't. Its lips curled into that same, unnatural grin. Then the glass cracked. A single jagged line, splitting the reflection in half. And from the other side, a hand pressed against the glass. But this time, the glass didn't hold. The crack spread, spiderwebbing outward. The mirror shuddered. And then, it shattered. I stumbled back as shards hit the floor, heart hammering. But there was no movement. No figure crawling out. Just broken glass and my own panicked reflection in the pieces. I didn't wait. I gathered every shard, every fragment, and took them outside. I doused them in lighter fluid and burned them. As the flames flickered, I swore I heard something. A whisper. A sigh. And then silence. I don't know if it's truly gone. But since that night, I haven't heard the tapping. I used to work night security at an old apartment complex. It wasn't a bad job, mostly just walking the halls, checking locks, and making sure no one was sneaking in. The place had been built in the 70s, and most of the tenants were elderly. Quiet, peaceful, until apartment 309. It had been vacant for months. The last tenant, an old man named Mr. Holloway, had passed away alone in his sleep. No family, no friends, just one of those people who faded away unnoticed. But after he died, strange things started happening. It began with noises. Tenants on the third floor would complain about scratching sounds in the walls, like something crawling through the vents. Maintenance checked but found nothing. No rats, no loose pipes. Just dust and silence. Then came the knocking. Residents swore they'd hear knocking coming from inside 309 at odd hours of the night. Slow, deliberate knocks. 3 at a time. But the apartment was empty. One night, around 2 a.m., I was doing my usual rounds when my radio crackled to life. "Security, come in." It was the front desk clerk, Janine. She sounded uneasy. "I just got a call from 307. They said someone's in the apartment next door. 309. I frowned. "That's impossible. It's locked." Well, they heard knocking, and a voice that sent a chill down my spine. I took the elevator up, my flashlight gripped tight in my hand. The hallway was silent. Too silent. I stopped outside 309 and pressed my ear to the door. At first, nothing. Just the hum of the building. Then, knock, knock, knock. Slow, rhythmic, coming from inside. I swallowed hard and pulled out my keys. The door swung open with a groan, revealing an empty, dark apartment. No furniture. No signs of life. Just dust floating in the beam of my flashlight. I stepped inside. "Security," I called. "Anyone here?" Silence. Then a sound. A faint, raspy whisper. I turned toward the source, the air vent. It was an old-fashioned, wide metal vent near the floor. The screws were missing. The grate was slightly ajar. And inside, 2 pale fingers curled around the edge. I stumbled back, heart slamming in my chest. The fingers twitched, then vanished into the darkness. I ran. I locked the apartment and called maintenance. When they arrived, they removed the vent cover and shined a light inside. Nothing. Just an empty, dust-coated shaft leading into the building's ventilation system. But before we left, I noticed something. The inside of the vent, deep in the metal tunnel, was covered in long, jagged scratch marks. Like something had been crawling in there. I quit 2 days later. A few weeks after that, I got a call from Janine. Another tenant had moved into 309. She lasted one night. When she left, she told the landlord one thing. There was a man in the vent, and he was smiling at me. I didn't want to hear any more about apartment 309. After I quit, I swore I'd never set foot in that building again. But something about Janine's voice over the phone stuck with me. She was scared. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I had a new job, a new apartment, a fresh start. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing those fingers curling around the vent. The slow, deliberate knocking. The whisper I knew I had heard. At 3:09 a.m., I woke up to my phone buzzing. A text from Janine. "He's back. Please come." My whole body went cold. I stared at the message, debating whether to ignore it. But something in my gut told me this wasn't just another noise complaint. I got dressed and drove to the complex. Janine met me at the front desk. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "The new tenant ran out screaming at midnight," she whispered. She said she saw him. I didn't ask who. I already knew. I took the master key and rode the elevator up to the 3rd floor. The hallway felt wrong, too still, too cold. The door to 309 was slightly open, swaying just a little. I stepped inside. The apartment was empty. The tenant's things were still there, half-unpacked boxes, a coat draped over a chair. Like she had left in a hurry. Then I heard it. A rustling noise. The air vent. I turned slowly. The grate was wide open now, the screws scattered across the floor. The tunnel inside was dark, stretching into the building's depths. And then, a voice. Raspy. Thin. "You came back." My blood turned to ice. Something moved inside the vent. A shape, shifting in the darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it watching me. Then, it crawled forward. Long, pale fingers gripped the edges of the vent. Then came the arms, too thin, the joints bending the wrong way. It pulled itself out inch by inch, slow and deliberate. And then I saw its face. Mr. Holloway. Or what was left of him. His mouth was stretched into an impossible grin, his skin sagging and gray. His eyes, black pits, locked onto mine. And then he whispered, "It's so empty in the walls. Stay with me." I ran. I don't remember getting to my car. I don't remember driving home. But I do remember one thing. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. And in the reflection, just for a second, I saw him. Not in the road, not in the building, but in my back seat, smiling. I was never one to believe in ghosts. I've always been a rational person, someone who needs to see evidence before believing in something. But after what happened last night, I'm not so sure anymore. I live in an old house, one that's been in my family for generations. It's a bit creaky and drafty, but I love it. It's full of character and history. But lately, I've been hearing things, strange noises that I can't explain. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the old house settling. But then the noises started to get louder, more distinct. I would hear footsteps in the hallway, even when I knew I was alone in the house. I would hear whispers, like someone was trying to tell me something. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was all in my head. But then last night, something happened that I can't explain. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a loud bang from downstairs. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly made my way downstairs. The house was dark and silent. I crept through the living room, my flashlight beam dancing across the walls. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But then I heard it again, a loud bang from the kitchen. I froze, my blood running cold. I didn't want to go into the kitchen, but I knew I had to. I took a deep breath and slowly pushed open the door. The kitchen was empty. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but there was nothing out of place. I was about to turn around and go back upstairs when I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows by the back door. I screamed and jumped back, my flashlight falling to the floor. The figure didn't move. It just stood there in the darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it back on. But the figure was gone. I stood there for a moment, my heart still pounding. I didn't know what I had seen. But I knew one thing. I wasn't alone in the house. I ran back upstairs and locked myself in my room. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just lay there in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the old house. I don't know what I saw last night, but I do know that I'm not alone in this house. And I'm scared to find out what else is lurking in the shadows. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the old house. Every time I heard a noise, I would hold my breath and wait for it to happen again. But it never did. The house was silent except for the occasional creak or groan. I finally fell asleep just before dawn. But it was a fitful sleep, full of nightmares. I dreamed that I was being chased through the dark house by a shadowy figure. I could hear its footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I could feel its cold breath on my neck. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. The sun was streaming through my window. I got out of bed and went to the bathroom. I splashed some water on my face and looked in the mirror. I was pale and drawn. I looked like I hadn't slept in days. I went downstairs and made myself a cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to make sense of what had happened the night before. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew that I wasn't alone in the house. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't know what to tell them. I didn't have any proof that anything had happened. I decided to try to find out more about the history of the house. Maybe I could find some clues about what was going on. I went to the library and started researching the house. I found out that it had been built in the 1800s by a wealthy family. The family had lived in the house for several generations, but they had eventually moved away. The house had been empty for many years before my family bought it. I didn't find anything about the family that seemed out of the ordinary, but I did find one thing that was strange. There was a rumor that the house was haunted. The rumor said that the ghost of a young woman who had died in the house was still there. I didn't know what to make of the rumor. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I couldn't explain what I had seen the night before. I decided to keep an open mind. I went back to the house and started exploring. I went through every room, looking for anything that might be out of place. I didn't find anything unusual. I was about to give up when I went into the basement. The basement was dark and damp. It was full of old furniture and boxes. I started rummaging through the boxes, looking for anything that might be interesting. I found a box that was full of old photographs. I started looking through them. Most of them were pictures of the family who had lived in the house. But then I found a picture of a young woman. She was beautiful, with long black hair and piercing blue eyes. I turned the picture over and read the inscription on the back. It said, Emily 1865. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew that Emily was the name of the young woman who was said to be haunting the house. I put the picture back in the box and closed it. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I went back upstairs and didn't go back into the basement. I didn't know what to do. I was scared to stay in the house, but I didn't know where else to go. I didn't have any friends or family who could help me. I decided to try to contact a paranormal investigator. I found a few names online and called them, but they all wanted to charge me a lot of money. I didn't have that kind of money. I was starting to feel desperate. I didn't know what to do. Then one day, I was talking to my neighbor about what was happening. She told me that she knew a woman who was a psychic. She said that the woman might be able to help me. I was skeptical, but I was willing to try anything. I called the woman and made an appointment to see her. I went to see the psychic the next day. She was a kind old woman. She told me that she could sense a presence in my house. She said that it was the ghost of a young woman who had died in the house. The psychic said that the young woman was not evil. She was just lost and confused. She didn't know how to move on. The psychic said that she could help the young woman move on. She asked me if I wanted her to do it. I said yes. The psychic went to my house and performed a seance. She said that she was able to communicate with the young woman. She told her that it was time to move on. The young woman's ghost left the house. I haven't seen or heard anything since then. I think the psychic helped her move on. I'm not scared of the house anymore. I feel safe here. I'm not sure if I believe in ghosts, but I do believe that there are things that we don't understand.